Okay, so let's take a look at passage 6. As usual, I would like you to decide if it's an argument or not. So pause the video, think about that, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so what did you decide? It looks to me like this is an argument. Did you spot the conclusion? If you didn't, I want you to think about that. So pause the video, identify the conclusion, and come back when you're ready. Okay, what did you decide? It looks to me like the conclusion is right here. Clearly, utilitarianism isn't correct. Now, take a look at the claims before that conclusion and the claims after that conclusion. Are they part of the argument or not? Think about that for a moment, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so what did you decide? It looks to me like the passages before the conclusion are part of the argument, and that or at least some of the claims in back of the conclusion or after the conclusion are parts of the argument. What does that tell us about overall argument structure? Remember, we've seen this before. When the conclusion is in the middle of the passage, in the middle of the argument rather, with some reasoning before and some reasoning after, if the argument is competently written, the conclusion is going to split probably between lines of reasoning. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but it's a good rule of thumb. If you see an argument that has the conclusion in the middle, probably there's going to be lines of reasoning on either side of the conclusion. So with that in mind, let's map this. Take a look at the first part of the argument before the ultimate conclusion, identify the important claims there, and map it. I'll give you a moment, so pause the video and come back when you're ready. Okay, so what did you decide? Looks to me like if utilitarianism were correct, then the motives behind an action wouldn't matter, is important. And by the way, that's true because utilitarianism says that really the only thing that matters is the consequences of the action. So a common criticism of utilitarianism is, no, when we try to evaluate whether an action is ethical or not, we also look at what the person had in mind or what they were trying to do, what their motives were, not just what they in fact ended up doing, because sometimes we can have the best intentions and really try hard and things don't work out, right? So that's one claim. If utilitarianism were correct, then the motives behind an action wouldn't matter. Note, we keep that together because that's one claim. We don't split around if-thens. This claim is not saying that utilitarianism is correct, and it's not saying that the motives don't matter. It's just saying that if utilitarianism were correct, then they wouldn't matter. What about the motives behind an action do matter? That's important too. And note, do you see how if we didn't recognize that number 2 is a conditional and it doesn't assert its parts, we would be very confused at this point because we would be saying, oh my gosh, this argument contradicts itself. Here it says that motives don't matter and here it says motives do matter, but no, this passage doesn't say that the motives don't matter. It just says that if utilitarianism were correct, which it might not be, then the motives wouldn't matter. So we have 2 claims. We don't want to get more than that. Generally speaking, there's a couple of exceptions to that we'll be seeing in the next chapter, foreshadowing. But right now, if there's 2 claims, we're just going to figure out how they are related to each other and map that. So think about that, right? How are 2 and 3 related to each other? With an arrow, an inference, with a plus, dependent reasons are separate. Think about that. Map that part of the argument, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Okay, what did you get? I think that they are added together. But remember is, and as you can see, I've decided that I like this narrower pen better. I might change my mind, but right now I like this. But is an inference eraser, like and inference erasers are often pluses. Also, if we think about the puzzle piece test, what do we get? Well, what's in common between this claim and that claim? the claim 2 and 3. Well, the motives behind an action mattering, right? What's left over? Well, the negation here from the back part and utilitarianism were correct. We put those together, we get utilitarianism is not correct. Okay. By the way, if you remember, when we talked about passage 5, I used the puzzle piece test to show that two claims are in fact added together, and they were added together according to the puzzle piece test, but it was still a bad inference, right? The puzzle piece test can help us to decide that two claims are probably intended to be added together. It's a way to identify the relationship between those claims. It's not a reliable way necessarily to evaluate the inferences, because the fallacy of assuming the consequent, the fallacy of negating the antecedent, perfect from the point of view of the puzzle piece test, right? But they're still invalid. So only use the puzzle piece test to decide that two claims are added together, not to evaluate the inference. Okay, let's return. Once we add 2 and 3 together, we want to start getting in the habit of, as soon as we add things, figuring out what follows from them, what conclusion follows from them. This again is because in the next chapter, sometimes the claim that follows from different claims won't be explicitly stated. We'll have missing conclusions, and then we want to add them. But for now, it's just a useful habit to get into. So take a look at 2 and 3 and ask yourself what follows from them once we put them together. Pause the video, think about that, and come back when you're ready. Okay, do you see it? Let's see. If utilitarianism were correct, then the motives behind an action wouldn't matter. But the motives behind an action do matter. Does that start to sound like an argument form that we've seen before? At this point, whenever you see an if-then claim added to another claim, go right away into those argument forms we've seen, the two good ones and the two bad ones, and use those. So let's think about what argument form this is. If utilitarianism were correct, that's the front part, then the motives behind an action wouldn't matter. That's the back part. The motives behind an action do matter. Now, what is that in terms of fronts and backs? Is it the front? Is it the back? Is it the opposite of the front, or is it the opposite of the back? Pause, think, and come back. Okay, what do you think? It's the opposite of the back, right? The back here says the motives behind an action would not matter, and this says they do matter. That's the opposite of that. So we have if front, then back. Opposite of back, what can we conclude from that? Opposite of front, right? Is that valid or not? It's valid, right? And if you're not sure, poodle dog it. Now, remember, what you poodle dog is not the English, because if you poodle dog the English, you might accidentally pick up on this wouldn't and say something like, if Max were a poodle, then Max would not be a dog, and then now you're all confused, right? What you poodle dog is the argument form that you extract from the English. So use the English to identify the fronts and backs. Then, once you have that argument form identified, in this case, if front, then back, opposite of back, therefore opposite of front, then you can use the poodle dog to decide if that's any good. You think, if Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Max is not a dog. Can you conclude Max is not a poodle? Think, pause, come back. You can. So 1 follows from 2 and 3. And it would follow from 2 and 3 in the sense that this is what the author has in mind, even if it were invalid. But as a matter of fact, not only is this what the author has in mind, it is what the author should have in mind. So that's a valid inference. That is modus tollens. Good. So let's move on. Oh, by the way, why did I end this argument right now? Like instead of worrying about, well, will something after this follow it? It's because I hit the ultimate conclusion. And that means that that line of reasoning is probably over. So the next step is probably going to be over here. So let's take a look at that. Continue reading after the also. Identify the important claims, map it, and evaluate the inference. Do all of that. First, identify the important claims, map it, and evaluate the inference. Pause the video and come back when you're ready. Okay, identify the important claims. Also, well, first I want to give some props to this also. That also reaffirms the fact that we're probably in another line of reasoning here. Words like also, words like besides, you'll get the flavor of them. Also, if it's ethical to kill one person in order to save 100 others, then utilitarianism would be correct. That's one claim. I am not going to divide that because that's an if-then. But it isn't ethical to kill one innocent person in order to save 100 others. That's another claim. How are they related? With a plus. The but is an inference eraser, will probably be a plus. Also, you might be starting to pick up on the fact that if you put 4 and 5 together, you have one of those inference forms. You might even see that before you recognize whether it's a good inference form or a bad inference form. It just fits a form, which is great. I mean, if that's what you see, that's great. So it's going to be 4 plus 5. And where do they go? What follows from them? This. So let's take a look at the inference that takes us from 4 and 5 to 1. Is that valid or not? Well, let's see. Let's think about fronts and backs. If it's ethical to kill one innocent person in order to save 100 others, so that's the front, then utilitarianism would be correct. That's the back. It isn't ethical to kill one innocent person in order to save 100 others. That's the opposite of the front, right? And we are concluding from that that utilitarianism isn't correct. That's the opposite of the back. So this inference is, if front then back, opposite of front, therefore opposite of back. Is that valid or not? I know it's not, because I know the forms, because it's my job to know them inside and out. But if it weren't my job, and if I had to think about it, because I don't do this like all day, every day, I would poodle dog it. I would think, okay, the form that we have in hand here is if front, then back, the opposite of the front, the opposite of the back. Would that work with poodle dog? What would that be? If Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Now we want the opposite of the front. Max is not a poodle. And we are concluding the opposite of the back. Max is not a dog. Does that work? If Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Max is not a poodle, so Max is not a dog. No, there's lots of other ways to be a dog than being a poodle. So this inference is bad. Now, before we leave number 6, I want to know, do we know that this argument is good or bad at this point? And if we do know, what is it? Is it good or bad? And if we don't know, what more information would we need to get in order to decide? Okay, so pause the video, think about that, come back when you're ready. Okay, we don't know yet, right? I mean, I do know, because of this inference being bad, that the right-hand side of reasoning is not going to work. But this side of reasoning over here on the left, I don't know for sure that's good. I know that the inference is good. That's great. But what about claim 2? What about claim 3? right? Are they good? Well, I can tell you that 2 is true. If utilitarianism were correct, then the motives behind an action wouldn't matter, at least under many versions of utilitarianism. Ethics is not my specialty, but as I understand ethics, that's pretty true. 3, the motives behind an action do matter. Now here I suppose there is some room to disagree. It is certainly the case that if you weren't already convinced of the ultimate conclusion, you might not be inclined to believe 3. So that could look circular, but then remember what we said before about the whole theory data thing. It looks to me like what this author is trying to do is force the choice. Which would you rather do? Would you rather live with utilitarianism and accept this, you know, this weird fact that motives don't matter? Or do you want to kind of deny that fact and say, no, I think that motives do matter, and reject the theory of utilitarianism? Lots of people think that motives do matter, and if they are right, then 2 would be true and 3 would be true. Let's just assume they are right. And that would make the argument good, because there is one good line of reasoning. What does that tell us about the ultimate conclusion? Does that tell us if the conclusion is true or false, or don't we know? Think about that for a moment, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so what do you think? If this argument is good, because the left-hand line of reasoning is good, we should think that the conclusion is true. That's the whole reason we want to look at arguments, because if they're good, they tell us something. Okay, excellent. So that is number 6. We will take a look a little bit about argument form, something else, and then we're going to go on to the next passage. But before then, you can expect more logic facts. I'll see you there.